Today's daf, Be'ezras Hashem, is Masechta Menachos Daf Dalid, number 4. And just briefly, we're going to start from Daf Dalid, about like 10 lines from the bottom, 10 lines from the top. Chutz minchas choyta minchas kanois. I'm just going to briefly review the Gemara from yesterday so that we close the sugya. The Gemara basically yesterday had dealt with a question. The question was that on Daf Beis Amid Beis, we have a stira between Rab Shimon and Rab Shimon. In one place, on top of Beis Amid Beis, Rab Shimon says, as you can see on the screen, Kol ha-menachos shenikmetzu shaloi lishmon, any mincha that you did the kamitza and you did it shaloi lishmon, it means, let's say it's a brittle type of mincha. And you say which is called a machvas, and you say I'm doing the kamitza, and I'm saying this is a marcheshes mincha. That's what the kohen did. So Rab Shimon said, not like our Mishnah, but he said kisheros, this is a kosher mincha. And the owner of this mincha does not have to bring a new mincha. We just ignore what the kohen just said. Okay, that's what he said. It's kosher. Then there's another brisa that says Rab Shimon says the opposite. Rab Shimon says that a mincha is like an asham, and therefore Rab Shimon says in the second brisa, we'll call it B. Leficha kmatza shloi lishma. If you do the kamitza and didn't say the right name, when the kohen said did the kamitza didn't say the right name, kishera, that's fine, it's kosher. Be'ena maratza, it didn't work for the owner. That means eina maratza means that the owner has to bring a new mincha. So now you have a stira. One brisa says it works for the owner, and one brisa says it doesn't work for the owner. So Rabbah, there's 3 turutzim, and that's the whole sugya of yesterday. Rabbah gave a teretz, and he said like this, that it depends. If you're changing the name of the carbon, if you're changing the name of the mincha, you're calling it, instead of a machvas, if the kohen is calling it a marcheshes, so it's obviously a blatant lie because everybody could see in his hand that it's a machvas type of mincha, not a marcheshes type of mincha. So in that case, since it's a blatant lie, it doesn't invalidate the mincha, and therefore the bailam was yaitze. He gets his kapara, whatever he wanted from that mincha. He doesn't have to bring a new one. But the second case is b'shinu baalim, where it's possible it could be true when the kohen made the kamitza and said, "Hey, I know this is for Shimon. Who paid for it? Reuven." He was supposed to say, "I'm doing the kamitza l'shem Reuven," and he says l'shem Shimon. So then it's not good, and the bailim has to bring a new one. Hi, Sheldon. We're just going to finish up a second, and then we're starting a new sugya in a minute. The second teretz that the Gemara brought to answer the stira between the 2 Rab Shimons is Rava's teretz. Rava says, "Loi kasha, it's not difficult. Kam b'koimitz mincha l'shem muncha." That the first case where it works according to Rab Shimon. Rab Shimon, if you do the kamitza, if it says machvas, and he says, "Oh, it's a marcheshes," the kohen does that, it's kosher. That's because he switched it from one mincha to another mincha. But Khan, the second case where it says it doesn't work, where it says that the owner has to bring a new mincha, is b'koimetz mincha l'shem zebach. He said, "I'm doing the kamitza, and I'm imagining that this is like an animal carbon." Well, so therefore, since he's so far off base, he invalidates the mincha. So Rava holds that if you're very far off base, like from a mincha to a zebach, you invalidate the mincha. But if you say that it's a different type of mincha, if it's instead of a machvas, you call it, the kohen called it a marcheshes when he did the kamitza, he did not invalidate it. And that's basically because he has a pasuk. The zois toras ha-mincha. All minchas are the same, basically. But it doesn't say v'zois toras ha-mincha b'hazevach, that a mincha is like a animal carbon. So therefore, if you switch from a mincha to a mincha, okay, then it doesn't invalidate. But if you switch from a mincha to an animal, the Kohen calls it an animal carbon, so then he invalidates this mincha. And then the third teretz was Rav Ashi's teretz. Rav Ashi answered that it's not a difficult. When do we say that it works? Is if the Kohen, when he did the kamitza, said, "Hey, this is a soft, chewy type of mincha, the chewy type of texture." He called it a marcheshes texture. He didn't call it a mincha. So he's just commenting on the texture of the thing in his hand. So he didn't invalidate. But in the second case, where he invalidates the mincha, is when he calls it a different type of mincha. So when he says kan minchas machvas l'shem minchas machashes. So in the second case, he called it a different type of mincha. He says this is not a minchas machvas, this is a marcheshes mincha. If he says it that way, then he invalidates the mincha, and the owner would have to bring a mincha. And those were the three terutzim between Rav Ashi, Rava, and Rabba's teretz, and that answered the stira of Rab Shimon to Rab Shimon. And the Gemara goes back and forth until we got to Dal Ram and Aleph of why Rabba and Rav Ashi and Rava had to each give a different teretz. They didn't like each other's teretz on how to resolve that contradiction of Rab Shimon to Rab Shimon. Now we go on to a brand new sugya. And that brand new, it's just an explanation of the Mishnah. Let's go back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah said clearly, right, here's the Mishnah. He says any mincha, right? The kamitza, remember how the kamitza looks? The kamitza is this, right? The guy, any kamitza, right over here. You do the kamitza on a flower offering. Sometimes it looks like a piece of challah. Anyway, the Mishnah says, any mincha that you do the kamitza shloi lishmon, if the Kohen says, it calls it the wrong name, kisheros, it's a kosher mincha, meaning that you throw it onto the mizbeach and the other kahanim eat the leftovers. Ella but shleolu labailim l'shem chayva. The owner of that mincha has to bring a new one. He didn't fulfill his obligation or his promise. Chutz, except the minchas choyte, the mincha that's brought for a specific type of sin. There's certain sins that you bring a mincha for. What's the answer? What's the type of sin? We learned if you swear falsely, right? So the Torah tells you that if you want to do tshuva, you bring an animal. If you can't afford an animal, bring a bird. If you can't afford a bird, bring a mincha. So that minchas chayte, if the kohen, it's supposed to be a minchas chayte, and the kohen does the kamitza and says, "Oh, this is a minchas nedava, it's a donation." So then, not only that, you have to throw the whole thing in the garbage. Uminchas kanois, or the mincha that a soita brings. So a mincha that a soita lady brings, before she takes a drink, she brings a mincha. Here it's a barley type of mincha. So there, again, if the kohen did the minchas kanois and calls it something else, so that's it. You throw the whole thing in the garbage. Okay, I want to compare it to like if you go to a matzah bakery. All right, nobody's going to give you this example, but if you go to a matzah bakery right now, so if it's baked well, right, and with all the halachos, so then it's l'shem matzahs mitzvah. Then you could use it for your seder. Sometimes they bake the matzah and they forgot to say l'shem matzahs mitzvah. So then that type of matzah is kosher. It's not chometz, but you can't use it for your seder. And then there's a third type of matzah where they baked it, but they baked it after 19 minutes. So it's chametz. So therefore it's unusable. You have to throw it out. Same thing. There's three types of minchas. So let's go back into the Gemara over here. Daf Daled Aleph chutz meminchas choyte. So the Mishnah says chutz meminchas choyte minchas kanois. If the kohen did the minchas choyte and the minchas kanois, and he called it something else, you have to throw the whole thing out, right? You have to throw the whole thing out. So the Gemara says, why not? Why should you? So the Gemara says, Bishlam a minchas choyte, a mincha, a choyte mincha, chatas karya rachmana. The Torah calls a minchas choyte like a regular animal chatas. And where do you see that? The Torah tells you the minchas choyte is lo yosim ala shemen, don't add oil. Don't add frankincense. Ki chatos he, because it's like an animal chatos. Now, an animal chatas, if you shecht, we learned the first daf in the Masechta Zvachim, if you shecht an animal chatas and say it's an oila, you have to throw the whole thing out. So that the same thing would apply by minchas chayte. If the kohen shechts it, if the kohen does the kmitza shloy lishma, you have to throw the whole thing out. So there, I have a source. A minchas chayte has to be thrown out. Ela minchas kanois minalon. How do I know a soita mincha? If you do it, if the kohen says it, calls it the wrong name, you have to throw it out. Answers the Gemara, I'll find a source for it. The Tani Kame the Rav Nachman. There was a brisa that taught. There's a brisa person, a little student, learned in front of Rav Nachman and said the following halacha: Minchas kanois mesaris l'ndava. A minchas kanois, a soita mincha. If a woman, let's say, separated money to buy a minchas kanois, and it cost her less money than she put away. So what does she do with the extra money? She puts it in the pushka in the base of Migdash, and they buy carbon oilers with it. So let's say she put away $100, and it only cost her $70 for her mincha. So $30 belonging to the pushka of the base of Migdash, and they buy animal carbons. How do you know that? Maybe she can keep it. Or how do you know that? Because there's a Gzera Shava. Amalei, Rab Nachman says, I'll give you the source for it. Shapik Amrit, you're saying correct, because Mas'eres Oven Kisiv Boy, it says the word Ovoin by the Minchas Kanois. By Minchas Kanois, it says the word Maskeres Oven, so it calls it Ovoin. Uvachatas Kisiv Boy, and by a regular carbon chatas, V'oisa Nosan Lechem Losais as Avoin Hueda. So it says the word Avoin, you see Avoin by regular chatas, and it says the word Avoin by a Minchas Kanois. So just like a regular carbon chatas, if a regular carbon chatas, ma chatas moisoris nedava, just like a regular carbon chatas, if you separate $300 to buy an animal carbon chatas, and it only costs you $250, we know from other psukim that the rest falls, you're supposed to put in the pushk in the base of Migdash, af minchas kanois moisoris nedava. So also the mincha of kanois, also the extra belong into the pushkas of the base of Migdash. So once we know there's a link between a minchas kanois and a chatas, so then I'll link it all the way. Ma'oka chatas, ma chatas psula l'shloi l'shma, af minchas kanois psula l'shloi l'shma. So just like a carbon chatas, an animal chatas, it's possible if you say the wrong name. Af minchas kanois psula l'shloi l'shma. So also minchas kanois is possible shloi l'shma. So that's the source that a minchas kanois, it's linked already to chatas, so it will, because they teach you maisaris nedava. So therefore, we'll link it all the way and say that just like a chatas is pasur shloi l'shma, so also the minchas kanois is pasur shloi l'shma. Says the Gemara, if you're learning Gzera Shabbos, elamiata, asham yehi pasur shloi l'shma. If you sech the carbon asham, it should also be linked to a carbon chatas, and it should be invalidated shloi l'shma. And we know that's not true. When you shech the carbon asham, it's not, if you shech the shloi l'shma, it's still like a kosher carbon. And why should it be? Why don't we say the gama ovain mechatas? Because it says the word ovain by chatas, and it says avoinoi by asham. It says avoinoi. V'lo yada v'ashem. I have it here on the side. V'nosa avoinoi. So one can make a gezerah shava that an asham should have the same din as a chatas. Answers the Gemara. Done in ovain ma'ovain being done in avoinoi me'ovain. It's two different words. Because one is asham, it says the word avoinoi, and by chatas it says avoin. So you can't learn a gzera shava linking asham to a chatas. Oh, is that true? That every gzera shava have to be the exact same word? My nafkamina, what's the difference? Well, Tana Bei Rabbi Shmuel taught us Shava koyin uval koyin zuhi shiva zuhi bia. Rabbi Shmuel taught us that sometimes, even if they're not the exact same words, one says shav, and one says va, one says return, one says coming, but they mean the same thing. So you could learn Gzeir Shava. So avoin and avoin is close enough that you could learn Gzeir Shava. And furthermore, ligma avoin shmias koil. The ksiv by the carbon, the animal carbon of a shvua of swearing falsely. There it also says the ksiv imloy yagid benosa avoinoi. So it says v'nasa avoinoi by shmias koil. So why don't we say by that you link a carbon of by shvua to just like a carbon chatas, that if you shecht it shloi lishma, it should be invalidated, and that's not true. Ella says the Gemara like this: the Gemara has to find a brand new source. Ella ki gamri gzeir shava l'moisin nedavu the gamri. The gzeir shava was one gzeir shava to teach you one din. That the extra of the minchas kanois goes to a nedava. L'moisin nedavu hu negamri. That just teaches you one halacha, that if the extra money for a minchas kanois put into the pushka, that it's similar to chatas. Maybe I should link it totally like a chatas. A minchas kanois is totally like a chatas because you can't make a gzeir shava halfway. Okay, so the Gemara says no. Shochat oisar lechatas oisar lishma kasher shloi lishma psulo. The Torah was very specific. Only a chatas, if you shech shloi lishma, it's kosher, and nothing else. No other animal carbon, if you're going to shecht it shloi lishma, is going to be possible. Only a chatas, and we also know a carbon pesach. Those are the two animal carbons that you shech shloi lishma, it's possible, and nothing can be learned from it. The Torah says it only applies by chatas, but nothing else. Avakol kachin, any other animal carbon, bein lishman, bein shloi lishman, whether you shecht lishman or shloi lishman, kisherim, it's kosher. So now, what is the source? Ella minchas choyte, minchas kanoyin, the psulim shloi lishman, minalan. We're back to square one. How do I know the flour offering of a minchas choyte and the flour offering of a soita? How do you know that the psulim shloi lishman, that it's possible if you do it shloi lishman, you have to throw the whole thing out? What's the source for that? And says the Gemara, there's a source by minchas choyte and there's a source by minchas kanois. Because let's think about this. Chatas time of mind. What's the reason why a carbon chatas, that if you shech shloi lishma, it's possible? Mishum d'ksiv bahi. The Torah tells you chatas he. By a regular animal chatas, it says he. This is the chatas, and only if you shecht it for a carbon chatas, it's kosher. Otherwise, it's possible. Achanami. So also by the mincha haksiv behi. By the minchas choyte, it says the word he, and by minchas kanois, it says the word he. So only by those two, minchas choyte, minchas kanois, will be the same din. That if you do an act shloi lishmam, you have to throw the whole thing out. It's not kosher. Says the Gemara, Asham Name Aksibehu, but by a carbon Asham, it says the word who. So why don't I say the same idea, that only if it's shechted for a carbon Asham, it's kosher. If you do and if you do it shechted for something else, it's possible. But we know it's not that. We don't say that. Why don't we darshan the who by Asham the same way we're darshan the he's by chatas? By the way, Asham is a male animal. That's why it says who. Answers the Gemara, if you look at the location where the Torah put the word who by Asham, it was after you did the haktaras of the Amrim. You put the fats on the mizbeach. It's long after you makter the fats. You brought the fats on the mizbeach. So and the whole idea of putting fats on the mizbeach, even if you didn't put the fats on the mizbeach, let's say you shechted the osham, you sprinkled the blood, and somehow the fats became tameh, it's still a kosher carbon. So the Gedetanya. So therefore, even if you did that shloi lishma, it certainly shouldn't invalidate the carbon. Gedetanya aval osham loy nema bayhu elalahacha aktoras emer. And so the word who appears after the burning of the fats. Who kosher. Even if you didn't bring at all the fats, it's still kosher. So certainly if I do bringing the fats shloi lishma, it's going to be kosher because you don't even have to bring it in the first place. So I don't have a source, by the way, for an asham. If you shecht it shloi lishma, it's invalid. I have no source for that. But it still says the word who there. What does who teach you by the carbon asham? Says the Gemara, look at the Rav Huna Amarav. It teaches you what Rav Huna Amarav said. what Rav Huna Amarav says, Asham shenitak l'reiyo shachtoi stam kosher. An asham, let's say the owner of this asham died. Now, what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to give the animal to the shepherd. It's supposed to wait for the animal to get a blemish and then sell the animal and buy a carbon oila from the money. Let's say you already gave it over to the shepherd, and before it got a mum, you shechted it anyway for a carbon. So kosher l'shem oila. It's really an oila because the asham could turn into an oila even before it got a mum. So that's what it says. Only if it's an asham and you did not give it over to the shepherd to do anything with it, then it remains an asham. But nitak once you gave it over to the shepherd, yes, it turns into an oila. Loy nitak loy. But if you didn't give it over to the shepherd, loy, it's not an oila. So if you shechted it before you gave it over to the shepherd, then it's invalid. Then it's not an oila, and the owner is dead. So amakra hu bahaviyase yehei. That only it stays a carbon asham as long as you didn't give it over to the shepherd. But once you gave it over to the shepherd, then it removes its name asham and it becomes an oila, even if it didn't have a mum. Okay, so now basically you just learned one basic idea that minchas chayte and minchas kanois, if the kohen did something and said it called it something else, you have to throw the whole thing out. As opposed to another mincha, it's kosher and could be eaten by the Kohen, just the owner has to bring a new one. Amar Rav said, Minchas ha'omer shekamatzeh shloi l'shma psula. Rav said an idea that there's another case. A minchas ha'omer, it's a tzibur mincha that's brought from barley that allows people to eat the chadash, right? So that's brought on the 15th of Nisan, 16th of Nisan. So this minchas ha'omer, if it's a tzibur type of mincha, that the kamitza of these barley was done shloi l'shma, let's say the kohen that did the kamitza called it something else, psuli, you have to throw the whole thing out. Hoyel ubas lahatev lo yitira, since it's coming to permit people to eat chadash, and it didn't accomplish anything, so you have to throw the whole thing out. You can say the same idea, but Asham Nazir, we go to Amid Beis, Asham Mitzoyer Sheshachtem Shloi L'Shma, by these animal carbonis that are supposed to allow the Nazir to drink wine or the Mitzoyer to eat kachim, that you shechted it Shloi L'Shma. So it's an Asham. Typically an Asham, if you shechted Shloi L'Shma, it's kosher animal. But since this was supposed to be more than, it's not bringing a kapara, it's supposed to allow something to happen. So psulin, it's possible. Since it was supposed to machshir something, and it didn't accomplish that, so then you throw the whole thing out. So now the Gemara asks the question against Rav Tanan. We learned in the Mishnah, every mincha that you did the kamitza, calling it something else, it's kosher, right? But the owner has to bring a new one. Chutz, the only two exceptions are minchas chayte, minchas kanois, right? Minchas chayte, minchas kanois. If Rav is correct, right? Listen to Nami, let it also say chutz minchas ha'omer. Let it say except minchas ha'omer. I believe it's Rav who said it, right? Minchas ha'omer. So how come our Mishnah didn't say it? Answers the Gemara, 3 terutzim. Kitani, when is our Mishnah talking about? Ba yachid, ba tzibur like Tani. Our Mishnah is talking about minchas yachidim, not a minchas tzibur. Number 2, kitani, ba beglal atzmei, ba beglal zevach like Tani. The minchas ha'omer has an animal carbon, a sheep carbon along with it. So that our Mishnah is not discussing. Our Mishnah is discussing plain vanilla benimchas. And kikatani, also our Mishnah is talking about hadak she'ein kvu elehem zman, those type of minchas that don't have a time schedule for it. Ha the kvu ela zman like tani. But if it has a time schedule to it, in other words, it has a time associated with it, then our Mishnah is not talking about. You see, a minchas chayte, minchas kanois could be brought at any time. It depends when the site is. It's not subject to time. But minchas omer is only brought on the Tazayin Benissen. It's not under the discussion of our Mishnah, and therefore you can't ask our Mishnah why didn't it list minchas omer. Ayam Amar, we learned previously. Rav said that in Asham Nazar and Asham Mitzayra that you shech shloi l'shman is possible. since it's a type of asham that's supposed to allow the nazir to drink wine and the mutzaira to eat kachim, if you shechted shloi lishman, since it didn't accomplish anything, you have to throw the whole animal out. Wait a second. So now we learned in the Mishnah, Kol azvachim shel shachtir shloi lishman kasherim ashlo olu b'ay l'shem chayivda chutz me pesach v'chatas. The Mishnah Masechta Zvachim only lists a pesach and chatas as pasol if you shech shloi lishman, but everything else is kosher shloi lishman. If Rav is correct, list the name chutz me asham nazir v'asham mitzayra debar lahachshiv leichshirah. Let it say asham nazir and asham mitzayra as in that list, like chatas and asham, like pesach and chatas, that it's possible if he shech the shloi lishman. And says the Gemara, Kaven the ika asham zel v'asham ilas the chapara asik. Not every asham will be possible. Asham gezelas and asham meilas the kapara asik loy psikale. It's not a general absolute rule because an asham gezelas and asham meilas that are brought for forgiveness. So therefore, it does accomplish something, even if you shechted it shloi lishman, some forgiveness happens. So therefore, it would be kosher like psikale. That's why asham is not included. Says the Gemara. Gemara wants to understand this. My shna, what's the difference? Asham nazir v'asham mitzayra the boy lahachshiv leichshiroi. And asham nazir and asham mitzayra that's coming to be matter something, and it didn't accomplish. What do you say? It's puzzle. Haninami. So an asham gzelas and asham ilas, if you shechted shloi lishman, boy lakapara, it's supposed to come to bring forgiveness. But if you shechting it shloi lishman, loy kipru, it's not going to be mechaper. So why is that kosher b'diavad and asham nazir, asham gezelis, and asham eilas? So concludes let's conclude the Gemara. Matzinu Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah said like this: Matzinu shechilik hakosa bein mechaper bein mechshirem. That we find that the chumash is much more lighter on an animal that's bringing a forgiveness than an animal that's coming to be matir something. Mechaper, if it's a type of carbon that's bringing about an atonement, even if the guy died, even if the owner died, is behu the asalachamisa. Sometimes you bring it after the person died. Machshirin, an animal that's supposed to allow something to be done, leis behu de la'achal misa. It cannot be brought after the owner died. Let me give you the example, and that's we'll stop. The Tanam, we learned in the Mishnah, Ha'isha, a woman that gives birth, she has to bring two karbanas, a chatas and an oilam. Let's say, Shavia chatasa, she brought a carbon chatas, umesa, and she died. But she separated two birds. The oila, what should they do with the oila? Yavio yarshin oilasa, the yarshin should bring her oila, right? Because the oila is somehow bringing her an atonement. Somewhat, maybe she swore that she'll never have a baby again, and this is like some sort of atonement for her. So the yarshin should bring an oila. But let's say before she died, she brought the oilasa mesa. She brought a carbon oila and then died. Lo yaviu yarshin chatasa. The yarshin don't bring her chatas, which although it's bringing an atonement to chatas, but it's also allowing her to eat kachim. So it's a machshir type of chatas. So we see that a machshir type of carbon is not brought after a person dies, after the owner dies, but a mechaper type of carbon is brought after a person dies. Therefore, very simple, a machshir type of carbon is so strict that if you shecht it shloi lishma, then it's possible. Throw the whole thing out. A mechaper type of carbon, if it's not as strict, because you see that you even after the person died, you can bring it. So therefore, if you shecht it shloi lishma, then it could also, if you shecht it shloi lishma, it's still a kosher carbon. Okay. Great. Let's just finish up the Gemara just to the end of the question. Maskav law, Rav Yehuda Bedrei, Rav Shimon ben Pazi, Rav Yehuda, the son of Rav Shimon ben Pazi, asked the question. Machshir, that mean nami me less like the asala chamisa. Does every machshir carbon cannot come after the owner died? But now we learned in the Mishnah. Hamafir shmoyes linizirasi. When a nazir finishes his naziris, he wants to drink wine again. So he has to bring a carbon oila a carbon shlamim and a carbon chatas. So let's say the Nazir separated money for his Naziris, right? And then he died, I guess. No, the Mafresh boys, he didn't die. We have a Nazir that separated money and like a pile of money for his Naziris. He's supposed to buy from that pile of money an oila, shlamim, and chatas. Well, a shlamim is a type of carbon that you don't moil in, but you don't get me'ila in because it's kachim kalim. So therefore, you don't know which of this money belongs to a shlamim, which of the money is a chatas, which money is an oila. So loy nehenem v'loy nema'alim, you can't have a naw from this money, but you don't get me'ila because you can take the entire money and buy one shlamim, or any coin within, you could have made that the shlamim. So it's not defined that the money that you pick up is chatas money, and therefore you don't have the me'ila there. But mace, let's say the Nazir died, and he didn't define, he had the money and it's piled up. What should you do with all the money? Yiplin and Dava, let them all fall for a oila donation. Mifay let's say he had 3 piles of money. One he called chatas money, one money he called an oila money, and one he called shlamim money. So demei chatas yolim yamamelech. So the water, the money of the chatas, you throw into yamamelech, into the salt sea, because it's chatas shemesa ba'aleh. You get rid of the money, right? Shlamim, but you don't get mila in it because it's not going to the base of Mikdash. Like nehanim v'loy ma'alim. The may oila, the money of the oila, well, he's dead, but yavi ben oila may alam ben. You bring a carbon oila, and there is mila in it. The may shlamim, yavi ben shlamim, and acholim yem echad ve'initun lechem. It's a shlamim that's eaten for one day, like a nazir shlamim. Now, so we do bring the oila and we do bring the shlamim after the nazir died. Well, oila shlamim, the oila and shlamim, the nazir the machshiruninu, that allow the nazir to what the point of bringing this oila and shlamim? Because when he brings the chatas oila and shlamim, and then he takes a haircut and he cooks the shlamim with the hair and then eats the shlamim. Only then he's allowed to drink wine. So it's the oila and shlamim that allow him to drink wine. That's permitting him to drink wine. Because also la'achamisin, it comes after death. So we see that a machshir is like a regular kaper type of carbon, and therefore it comes after misa. So how could you differentiate between a chaper type of carbon with a machshir type of carbon? Amar Papa, it's different. A nazir is not necessarily the oil and shlamim is a machshir type of carbon. Why? An absolute hechsher, we never find that it comes after the owner died. With nazir, true, it's lechatchila, you should bring the oil and shlamim first before he could take the haircut, right? But it's not absolute, because we go to Ahmed Alas, to Amamar, we learned Gilach, if he took Gileach, if the Nazir took a haircut right after after the Chatas, Al Achas Mishlashim, one of those carbonas, Yatza, then he could drink wine, right? But still, it's the Chatas, so we see that it's not absolute that the Oila and the Shlomim are being machsher him. So therefore, it's not a machsher type of carbon. So we don't find really a machsher type of carbon that's brought after Nisa. So we will stop over here. This is Daf Yomi Menachos.